Well, welcome everyone to the monthly meeting webinar of the JFK Peace Speech Committee. My name is Martin Schatz, and I'm a member of the committee. And we're very pleased today on the 62nd anniversary of President Kennedy's speech to have Jeff Sachs with us to provide a commentary. As usual, we'll start with the speech, then we'll have Jeff's commentary and question and answers. And at the end, we have a special musical presentation from one of our members who has composed we'll have a brief segment of a choral work that she has composed based on the speech. So I'm going to turn it now to Amar Ahmad, who's managing the tech part of our program, to start the speech.
Wrote John Masefield in his tribute to English universities, and his words are equally true today. He did not refer to towers or to campuses. He admired the splendid beauty of a university because it was, he said, a place where those who hate ignorance may strive to know, where those who perceive truth may strive to make others see. I have therefore chosen this time and place to discuss a topic on which ignorance too often abounds and the truth too rarely perceived, and that is the most important topic on earth: peace. What kind of a peace do I mean, and what kind of a peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war, not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time. I speak of peace because of the new face of war. Total war makes no sense in an age where great powers can maintain large and relatively invulnerable nuclear forces and refuse to surrender without resort to those forces. It makes no sense in an age where a single nuclear weapon contains almost 10 times the explosive force delivered by all the Allied air forces in the Second World War. It makes no sense in an age when the deadly poisons produced by a nuclear exchange would be carried by wind and water and soil and seed to the far corners of the globe and to generations yet unborn. Today, the expenditure of billions of dollars every year on weapons acquired for the purpose of making sure we never need them is essential to the keeping of peace. But surely the acquisition of such idle stockpiles, which can only destroy and never create, is not the only, much less the most efficient, means of assuring peace. I speak of peace, therefore, as the necessary, rational end of rational men. I realize the pursuit of peace is not as dramatic as the pursuit of war, and frequently the words of the pursuers fall on deaf ears, but we have no more urgent task. Some say that it is useless to speak of peace or world law or world disarmament, and that it will be useless until the leaders of the Soviet Union adopt a more enlightened attitude. I hope they do. I believe we can help them do it. But I also believe that we must re-examine our own attitudes as individuals and as a nation, for our attitude is as essential as theirs. And every graduate of this school, every thoughtful citizen who despairs of war and wishes to bring peace should begin by looking inward, by examining his own attitude towards the possibilities of peace, towards the Soviet Union, towards the course of the Cold War, and towards freedom and peace here at home. First, examine our attitude towards peace itself. Too many of us think it is impossible. Too many think it is unreal. But that is a dangerous, defeatist belief. It leads to the conclusion that war is inevitable, that mankind is doomed, that we are gripped by forces we cannot control. We need not accept that view. I am not referring to the absolute, infinite concept of universal peace and goodwill, of which some fantasies and fanatics dream. I do not deny the value of hopes and dreams, but we merely invite discouragement and incredulity by making that our only and immediate goal. Let us focus instead on a more practical, more attainable peace, based not on a sudden revolution in human nature, but on a gradual evolution in human institutions, on a series of concrete actions and effective agreements which are in the interests of all concerned. There is no single simple key to this peace, no grand or magic formula to be adopted by one or two powers. Genuine peace must be the product of many nations, the sum of many acts. It must be dynamic, not static, changing to meet the challenge of each new generation. For peace is a process, a way of solving problems. With such a peace, there will still be quarrels and conflicting interests, as there are within families and nations. World peace, like community peace, does not require that each man love his neighbor. It requires only that they live together in mutual tolerance, submitting their disputes to a just and peaceful settlement. And history teaches us that enmities between nations, as between individuals, do not last forever. However fixed our likes and dislikes may seem, the tide of time and events will often bring surprising changes in the relations between nations and neighbors. So let us persevere. Peace need not be impractical, and war need not be inevitable. By defining our goal more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we can help all people to see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly towards it. And second, let us re-examine our attitude towards the Soviet Union. It is discouraging to think that their leaders may actually believe what their propagandists write. It is discouraging to read a recent authoritative Soviet text on military strategy and find on page after page wholly baseless and incredible claims, such as the allegation that American imperialist circles are preparing to unleash different types of war, that there is a very real threat of a preventative war being unleashed by American imperialists against the Soviet Union, and that the political aims, and I quote, of the American imperialists are to enslave economically and politically the European and other capitalist countries and to achieve world domination by means of aggressive war, unquote. Truly, as it was written long ago, the wicked flee when no man pursueth. Yet it is sad to read these Soviet statements, to realize the extent of the gulf between us. But it is also a warning to the American people not to fall into the same trap as the Soviets, not to see only a distorted and desperate view of the other side, not to see conflict as inevitable, accommodation as impossible, and communication as nothing more than an exchange of threats. No government or social system is so evil that its people must be considered as lacking in virtue. As Americans, we find communism profoundly repugnant as a negation of personal freedom and dignity. But we can still hail the Russian people for their many achievements in science and space, in economic and industrial growth, in culture, in acts of courage. Among the many traits the peoples of our two countries have in common, none is stronger than our mutual abhorrence of war. Almost unique among the major world powers, we have never been at war with each other. And no nation in the history of battle ever suffered more than the Soviet Union in the Second World War. At least 20 million lost their lives. Countless millions of homes and families were burned or sacked. A third of the nation's territory, including 2/3 of its industrial base, was turned into a wasteland, a loss equivalent to the destruction of this country east of Chicago. Today, should total war ever break out again, no matter how, our two countries will be the primary target. It is an ironic but accurate fact that the two strongest powers are the two in the most danger of devastation. All we have built, all we have worked for, would be destroyed in the first 24 hours. And even in the Cold War, which brings burdens and dangers to so many countries, including this nation's closest allies, our two countries bear the heaviest burdens. For we are both devoting massive sums of money to weapons that could be better devoted to combat ignorance, poverty, and disease. We are both caught up in a vicious and dangerous cycle, with suspicion on one side breeding suspicion on the other, and new weapons begetting counter-weapons. In short, both the United States and its allies, and the Soviet Union and its allies, have a mutually deep interest in a just and genuine peace and in holding the arms race. Agreements to this end are in the interests of the Soviet Union as well as ours, and even the most hostile nations can be relied upon to accept and keep those treaty obligations, and only those treaty obligations, which are in their own interest. So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal. Third, let us re-examine our attitude towards the Cold War, remembering we're not engaged in a debate, seeking to pile up debating points. We are not here distributing blame or pointing the finger of judgment. We must deal with the world as it is, and not as it might have been had the history of the last 18 years been different. We must therefore persevere in the search for peace in the hope that constructive changes within the communist bloc might bring within reach solutions which now seem beyond us. We must conduct our affairs in such a way that it becomes in the communist interest to agree on a genuine peace, and above all, while defending our own vital interests. Nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of a collective death wish for the world. To secure these ends, America's weapons are non-provocative, carefully controlled, designed to deter, and capable of selective use. Our military forces are committed to peace and disciplined in self-restraint. Our diplomats are instructed to avoid unnecessary irritants and purely rhetorical hostility, for we can seek a relaxation of tensions without relaxing our guard. And for our part, we do not need to use threats to prove we are resolute. We do not need to jam foreign broadcasts out of fear our faith will be eroded. We are unwilling to impose our system on any unwilling people, but we are willing and able to engage in peaceful competition with any people on earth. Meanwhile, we seek to strengthen the United Nations to help solve its financial problems, to make it a more effective instrument for peace, to develop it into a genuine world security system, a system capable of resolving disputes on the basis of law, of ensuring the security of the large and the small, and of creating conditions under which arms can finally be abolished. At the same time, we seek to keep peace inside the non-communist world, where many nations, all of them our friends, are divided over issues which weaken Western unity, which invite communist intervention, or which threaten to erupt into war. Our efforts in West New Guinea, in the Congo, in the Middle East, and the Indian subcontinent have been persistent and patient, despite criticism from both sides. We have also tried to set an example for others by seeking to adjust small but significant differences with our own closest neighbors in Mexico and Canada. Speaking of other nations, I wish to make one point clear. We are bound to many nations by alliances. These alliances exist because our concern and theirs substantially overlap. Our commitment to defend Western Europe and West Berlin, for example, stands undiminished because of the identity of our vital interests. The United States will make no deal with the Soviet Union at the expense of other nations and other peoples, not merely because they are our partners, but also because their interests and ours converge. Our interests converge, however, not only in defending the frontiers of freedom, but in pursuing the paths of peace. It is our hope and the purpose of Allied policy to convince the Soviet Union that she too should let each nation choose its own future, so long as that choice does not interfere with the choices of others. The communist drive to impose their political and economic system on others is the primary cause of world tension today. For there can be no doubt that if all nations could refrain from interfering in the self-determination of others, the peace would be much more assured. This will require a new effort to achieve world law, a new context for world discussions. It will require increased understanding between the Soviets and ourselves. An increased understanding will require increased contact and communication. One step in this direction is the proposed arrangement for a direct line between Moscow and Washington to avoid on each side the dangerous delays, misunderstandings, and misreadings of others' actions which might occur at a time of crisis. We have also been talking in Geneva about our first step measures of arms controls, designed to limit the intensity of the arms race and reduce the risk of accidental war. Our primary long-range interest in Geneva, however, is general and complete disarmament, designed to take place by stages, permitting parallel political developments to build the new institutions of peace, which would take the place of arms. The pursuit of disarmament has been an effort of this government since the 1920s. It has been urgently sought by the past 3 administrations. And however dim the prospects are today, we intend to continue this effort, to continue it in order that all countries, including our own, can better grasp what the problems and the possibilities of disarmament are. The only major area of these negotiations where the end is in sight, yet where a fresh start is badly needed, is in a treaty to outlaw nuclear tests. The conclusion of such a treaty, so near and yet so far, would check the spiraling arms race in one of its most dangerous areas. It would place the nuclear powers in a position to deal more effectively with one of the greatest hazards which man faces in 1963, the further spread of nuclear arms. It would increase our security. It would decrease the prospects of war. Surely this goal is sufficiently important to require our steady pursuit, yielding neither to the temptation to give up the whole effort, nor the temptation to give up our insistence on vital and responsible safeguards. I'm taking this opportunity, therefore, to announce two important decisions in this regard. First, Chairman Khrushchev, Prime Minister Macmillan, and I have agreed that high-level discussions will shortly begin in Moscow, looking towards early agreement on a comprehensive test ban treaty. Our hope must be tempered Our hopes must be tempered with the caution of history, but with our hopes go the hopes of all mankind. Second, to make clear our good faith and solemn convictions on this matter, I now declare that the United States does not propose to conduct nuclear tests in the atmosphere so long as other states do not do so. We will not be the first to resume. Such a declaration is no substitute for a formal binding treaty, but I hope it will help us achieve one. Nor would such a treaty be a substitute for disarmament, but I hope it will help us achieve it. Finally, my fellow Americans, let us examine our attitude towards peace and freedom here at home. The quality and spirit of our own society must justify and support our efforts abroad. We must show it in the dedication of our own lives. As many of you who are graduating today will have an opportunity to do by serving without pay in the Peace Corps abroad or in the proposed National Service Corps here at home. But wherever we are, we must all, in our daily lives, live up to the age-old faith that peace and freedom walk together. In too many of our cities today, the peace is not secure because freedom is incomplete. It is the responsibility of the executive branch at all levels of government, local, state, and national, to provide and protect that freedom for all of our citizens by all means within our authority. It is the responsibility of the legislative branch at all levels, wherever the authority is not now adequate, to make it adequate. And it is the responsibility of all citizens in all sections of this country to respect the rights of others and respect the law of the land. All this is not unrelated to world peace. When a man's way please the Lord, the scriptures tell us, he maketh even his enemies to be at peace with him. And is not peace, in the last analysis, basically a matter of human rights? The right to live out our lives without fear of devastation, the right to breathe air as nature provided it, the right of future generations to a healthy existence. While we proceed to safeguard our national interests, let us also safeguard human interests. And the elimination of war and arms is clearly in the interests of both. No treaty, however much it may be to the advantage of all, however tightly it may be worded, can provide absolute security against the risks of deception and evasion. But it can, if it is sufficiently effective in its enforcement, and it is sufficiently in the interest of its signers, offer far more security and far fewer risks than an unabated uncontrolled, unpredictable arms race. The United States, as the world knows, will never start a war. We do not want a war. We do not now expect a war. This generation of Americans has already had enough, more than enough, of war and hate and oppression. We shall be prepared if others wish it. We shall be alert to try to stop it. But we shall also do our part to build a world of peace where the weak are safe and the strong are just. We are not helpless before that task or hopeless of its success. Confident and unafraid, we must labor on, not towards a strategy of annihilation, but towards a strategy of peace. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, thank you again, everyone, for joining us. We're going to have our commentary, and then following that, we'll have a question and answer segment. If you would please put questions you have in the chat, we'll try and get to as many as we can. I know that our commentator doesn't need any words of introduction, but I'm going to say a few words of introduction anyhow. Jeffrey Sachs is a world-renowned economist and student of international relations. He is the author of many books, including To Move the World, JFK's
Quest for Peace.
Quest for Peace. Sorry about that. And I will just say this, if you're looking for somebody that embodies JFK's quest for peace today, we don't have to look any farther than our commentator this evening. Thank you very much, Jeff, for joining us.
Marty, thank you for that. And thank you, everybody, for gathering on this 62nd anniversary. Oh, my. Well, first, it's heartbreaking to listen what we lost. We certainly lost in our country the greatest statesman that we have had since Franklin Roosevelt, and a man who, in the year of that speech, was leading the world to peace and leading the world in an absolutely gifted way. Everyone should remember that it was just a few weeks after this speech that the US and the Soviet Union did sign the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. President Kennedy was proved absolutely correct. The treaty held. It was in the mutual interest of both sides. And as he said in the speech, it itself became a crucial stepping stone to a treaty a few years later, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. The speech was not only a speech of genius, it was a speech of remarkable persuasion. Persuasion in its logic and persuasion in its compassion. And when the speech was received by the Soviet chairman, Nikita Khrushchev, he immediately summoned the American envoy in Moscow, Averell Harriman, to say that this speech was the finest speech by an American president since Franklin Roosevelt, and, crucially, that he, Khrushchev, wanted to make peace with President Kennedy. In other words, the speech worked. It was a practical speech, as well as a completely timeless speech. When we listen to it just now, there's not a word that needs to be changed. to be applicable to our own time. What is terrifying is how the wisdom is not heeded in our time. We have absolutely departed from the profound insights that President Kennedy shared with us. One of the reasons why President Kennedy reached this depth of understanding and this level of stunning eloquence, and by the way, let us remember his partner in both the substance and in the eloquence, Theodore Sorensen, who was completely a partner in this speech in every way. One of the reasons that Kennedy reached this level of insight and wisdom and eloquence is that just a few months earlier, the world had nearly come to an end. The October 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis is the predicate of this speech. It's Kennedy's lessons derived from that most harrowing period. Kennedy and Khrushchev together saved the world in those days in October after having blundered the world to the very precipice of nuclear war. I always found it very touching, very moving, and profoundly sobering that President Kennedy came to office in January 20, 1961, determined to avoid war, fully aware of the dangers of stumbling into war, understanding the dangers of the nuclear age. And yet, despite all of that, absolutely playing a role in bringing the world to the very brink of nuclear annihilation. Let's just say that that was such a shocking period for both Kennedy and Khrushchev, and a moment in which both of them reached the realization that they were more partners than enemies in saving the world, and that they were each surrounded by warmongers, by naive advisors who, if the advice had been heeded, would have brought the world to nuclear war. So both Kennedy and Khrushchev, after this harrowing event in the Cuban Missile Crisis, realized how crucial it was to step back from the very edge of global destruction. And Kennedy succeeded in doing that, and this speech is a powerful part of Kennedy's quest for peace and his campaign for peace in 1963. I don't want to go through every bit of the speech in detail. We've just heard it, but I have to tell you, having read it dozens, maybe hundreds of times, and having watched it innumerable times to write my book about this speech and about this year, even now, as I read it again just before our meeting, I find it astounding in its logic and power and eloquence. And I want to draw our attention to a few points. First, he says, what kind of peace do I mean? And he says, not a Pax Americana, but a genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living. He immediately sets the stage that this is not some harsh condition. This is aiming for the good of the world. Then he talks about the new face of war. Total war makes no sense in an age when great powers can maintain large and relatively invulnerable nuclear forces and refuse to surrender without resort to those forces. That's the world that we are in today. Still, we're in a world of 9 nuclear powers. Russia, The successor state, the continuation state of the Soviet Union, has, as does the United States, 6,000 nuclear warheads, roughly 1,600 in active deployment. Neither side is going to be defeated before using those weapons. The idea, and we hear it every day, we should defeat Russia. We should defeat Putin. This is a mind-boggling miscalculation and misunderstanding. We are in the new face of war, and total war. Defeating Russia makes no sense in an age when great powers can maintain large and relatively invulnerable nuclear forces. Next, President Kennedy talks about the tragedy of the arms race, where he says that this accumulation of weapons never to be used is not the only, much less the most efficient, means of assuring peace. And so he calls peace the necessary rational end of rational men. This is wonderful, but we barely hear it in our world today, that we should be pursuing peace. We don't hear it once by European leaders any day these days. It's so sad and so worrisome, but Kennedy gets it so right. Then he says one of the most amazing things in this speech: to achieve peace, we must re-examine our own attitude, for our attitude is as essential as theirs. When is the last time an American president didn't point a finger at the enemy, but said, let us reconsider our own assumptions? Well, by saying that, President Kennedy opened the way to peace. He opened the way to the heart and the mind of Nikita Khrushchev and his counterparts. And he enabled both sides to re-examine their own attitudes. He says, let us examine our attitude towards peace itself, because too many of us think it is impossible. We hear that all the time. Oh, you can't negotiate with Putin. But this is exactly what Kennedy was warning us against. This kind of pessimism that makes it seem that war is inevitable, that mankind is doomed, that we are gripped by forces we cannot control. We cannot accept that view, says President John F. Kennedy. And he's right. And then he talks about what kind of peace: a practical peace, a peace of many parts, a dynamic peace, a peace that changes to meet the challenge of each new generation. And he makes an astoundingly wise statement. For peace is a process, a way of solving problems. It's an approach. It's a technique. It's not simply an end state. It's the way that one approaches crises. And then he says, it doesn't require that we love each other as our neighbors, only that we can live together in mutual tolerance. So wise, so practical, and so correct. Now, how to get there? He has a line that is one of my favorites. I repeat it nonstop in my adult life. He says, by defining our goal more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we can help all peoples to see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly toward it. This was Kennedy's style of leadership. Define a clear goal, show that it can be achieved, and thereby give hope, thereby have people draw irresistibly toward it. He did it with peace. He did it with going to the moon. He did it in his leadership, helping people to have a vision and then showing that the vision was and is within reach. How to achieve this? He says, don't fall into the trap of propaganda. Don't fall into the trap of thinking the worst of the other side. And he says that communication is essential. I say this every day, especially to the European leaders these days. They don't even try to talk to Russian counterparts. This is crazy. This is world-threatening. The foreign ministers don't talk to the Russian foreign minister. I've been in meetings where they go out of their way to have no contact. The leaders of Europe don't even pick up the phone. I offer them my Zoom account every day. It is so dangerous, the lack of communication. Then President Kennedy goes on to say that no government or social system is so evil that its people must be considered as lacking in virtue. He praises the Russian people. We can hail the Russian people for their many achievements in science and space, in economic and industrial growth, in culture and in acts of courage. And he notes that no nation in history of battle ever suffered more than the Soviet Union suffered in the course of the Second World War. How extraordinarily correct and magnanimous of the president. And we just had the 80th anniversary of the defeat of Nazism. And the Western leaders wouldn't say one word about the Russian role in that defeat. The Soviet Union lost 27 million people. And these shockingly, I don't know the word, undiplomatic and unwise leaders couldn't say one positive word, couldn't include Russia in the memorials at concentration camps that the Soviet Union itself had liberated. How can we make peace with this kind of stupid hatred? But that's what is happening today, the opposite of what President Kennedy counseled and what he achieved. Then he notes that, ironically, no matter what, it's the US and Russia that are most at risk. And this is true till today. We are at risk with the warmongering by the Europeans. We are at risk. I have to tell you the hard fact that when the SBU, the intelligence services of Ukraine, go and destroy part of the Russian nuclear triad, part of the strategic bomber fleet last week, we are the ones whose lives are imperiled by that, because Ukraine brought us closer to nuclear war last week. No thank you. But no doubt it did it with the knowledge and probably the support of the CIA and the MI6 and other intelligence agencies. It's a disgrace. Then President Kennedy tells us something that is denied every day. We're told, oh, you can't make peace with that side. And President Kennedy says the opposite. Even the most hostile nations can be relied upon to accept and keep those treaty obligations, and only those treaty obligations, which are in their own interest. His point is that peace is in mutual interest. It's not a favor. It is the mutual gain of both sides. And then he has my favorite words pretty much of all time. I have to read them because I love them. So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and to the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air, we all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal. So he lays it right on the line that we are a common humanity and we have our common interests, and because of that, we can make a common peace. He calls on us to persevere in the search for peace. And he tells us something which our leaders have absolutely abandoned, I have to tell you. And it's notable that he says, above all. In other words, of all the lessons that he has learned, of all that he is conveying, above all, while defending our own vital interests, nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of a collective death wish for the world. Do you know every day the Western governments are taunting President Putin, saying, oh, he's just bluffing. Don't worry about nuclear weapons. We're going to defeat President Putin. He's evil. We're going to defeat him. Don't worry about nuclear weapons. We are doing exactly what President Kennedy told us, above all, not to do. Do not put your adversary in the choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. That is a death wish, and our leaders are doing that. President Kennedy also says our diplomats are instructed to avoid unnecessary irritants and purely rhetorical hostility. That is our daily reality. Purely rhetorical hostility. Oh, he's absolutely crazy, or this or that. We cannot survive if we follow that course. President Kennedy, bless him, says we seek to strengthen the United Nations. And he goes on to talk about international law. He talks about non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries, about a new effort to achieve world law, and about the need for understanding, which requires increased contacts and communication. And this is absolutely true in all parts of the world. I travel and work in all parts of the world, in the Middle East, with Iran, with China, with India, with Russia. I can tell you the level of communication is shockingly low. We're not talking to other places with respect, with dignity, with the attempt to understand and the attempt to resolve differences. President Kennedy talks about our long-range goal of disarmament, how far we are from that today. He talks about the partial nuclear test ban treaty, although at the time of the speech, he's still hoping for a comprehensive test ban treaty, but the two sides were not able to resolve differences about how to monitor the treaty, so they went for an atmospheric test limit. But he said that this would place nuclear powers in a position to deal more effectively with one of the greatest hazards which man faces in 1963, the further spread of nuclear arms. And this is the point I mentioned earlier. The partial nuclear test ban treaty was the stepping stone to the non-proliferation treaty. Then President Kennedy, of course, says to achieve peace abroad, we need peace at home. And I remind you, this was at the height of the civil rights struggle. And this speech was given June 10, 1963. And on June 11, President Kennedy delivered the finest speech on civil rights ever given by an American president, back to back, where he talked about the basic truths that are as clear as as old as the scriptures and as clear as the United States Constitution. He had Martin Luther King stunned with the eloquence and with the power and with the commitment that President Kennedy showed to the civil rights cause. Notice that he says at the end of the speech, the United States, as the world knows, will never start a war. Alas, if only we had kept to that standard. We have started innumerable wars, I'm sorry to say. And this is something that we have to overcome in our foreign policy. But he bids us to be confident and unafraid and to labor on, not toward a strategy of annihilation, but toward a strategy of peace. How appropriate for June 10, 2025. Thank you very much. Thank you, Marty, for, as always, bringing us together to celebrate and learn from, and again, be recharged and inspired by this great wisdom.
Thanks very much, Jeff. I guess I wanted to maybe just start off, because I know when we air this speech, sometimes in the chat, people will put various comments which take issue with what the president is saying about the United States, such as, the United States will never start a war. And I wonder if you wanted to say a little bit about, this is the president of the United States giving a speech. This is not a peace activist with no power, so to speak, personal power. So I don't know whether you wanted to just sort of say a few words about just the context. Also, he had a lot of people surrounding him that did not want peace, which he knew about, and he wasn't about to take them to task publicly.
Let me say a few words about that.
Context, yeah.
Sure. First, President Kennedy came into office as a reader of Barbara Tuchman and her book, The Guns of August, which he read as, and she wrote as, explaining how the world stumbled, and the European powers in particular stumbled into World War I. And he was determined that that would not happen. That was for him the greatest disaster that needed to be avoided, stumbling into a war. And yet he almost did. And the question is why and how? And it goes back to the first days of the administration, when the new president was presented with a plan by the CIA, which is our worst and most failed institution in modern American history. It has created more disasters than any other institution in America. Presented President Kennedy with the plan that had been concocted in the Eisenhower period to invade Cuba, the Bay of Pigs invasion. And Kennedy was very uneasy about this, but he was new and young and did not feel in a position, right or wrong, to stop a plan that was underway. Of course, we know that the invasion was a disaster. What Kennedy was briefed on by Allen Dulles was a set of lies about how smoothly this would go, because Allen Dulles was intent on Kennedy having to react to an initial failure by giving air cover and bringing in the Air Force to attack Cuba. Kennedy did not do that, but he did go along with the basic plan, and the invasion of Cuba was in every way an utter failure and debacle. But one of the things that it led to was Khrushchev's decision to put nuclear arms in Cuba, because this was protecting a new ally. Of course, Khrushchev's decision was harebrained and reckless without question. And when he told his foreign minister, Andrei Gromyko, about the idea, Gromyko said, "What? A war?" And Khrushchev said, no, of course not a war. Not a war. Just let the Americans taste a bit of their own medicine. So he wanted to put it back to us. And of course, it almost led to nuclear war. I'm sure everybody knows, by the way, that we came within 1 second of nuclear war. Not minutes or hours, but 1 second. Because even after Kennedy and Khrushchev had agreed on backing off the missile crisis, the Russians would remove their missiles. Months later, the United States would remove its missiles from Turkey, and the U.S. would pledge never to invade Cuba again. Even after that agreement was reached, a disabled Soviet submarine came within 1 second of launching a nuclear-tipped torpedo, which, had it gone off under American doctrine, would have led to a full-fledged nuclear attack by the United States on the Soviet Union, Central Europe, and China, with an estimated 700 million deaths at the time, perhaps ending life on the planet, we now understand. But this came within a second because the captain's order to fire the torpedo was overruled, countermanded by a superior party officer that was in that submarine, that was part of a squadron in the Caribbean. Well, suffice it to say that one damn thing nearly led to another, to another, to another, to the end of the world that neither side wanted. So you could say Kennedy made his blunders, which he did, and he lied about the Bay of Pigs to Khrushchev when the invasion first started, and there were tensions. But through the Cuban Missile Crisis, both sides came to realize that the stakes were so high and the events were nearly out of control that they must not let that happen again. In 1963, Kennedy, as I think everybody knows, reached the decision that he would pull out of Vietnam. He started pullout in the November of 1963 with a reduction of 1,000 of the so-called advisors there. His real plan was win re-election in November 1964 and then pull out entirely from Vietnam. Many people believe, I am among them, that Kennedy was assassinated by the CIA or parts of the CIA and other rogue parts of the US government, substantially for his peace initiatives, actually. This is one of the most grim parts of all. Definitely there was CIA involvement in the assassination that to this day is covered up. So all of this is to say that was Kennedy telling the truth that the US would never start a war? Well, not quite, because the US had actually started a war in the Bay of Pigs. But Kennedy was trying to get on top of this. He was trying to control a war machine. One needs to understand America is a war machine. When you have 750 overseas military bases in 80 countries, when your military and security budgets adding up everything, the Pentagon, the CIA, the other intelligence agencies, Homeland Security, the nuclear program and the energy department, the veterans programs, when you add it all up, it's about $1.5 trillion. When you have a business so large, that's a war machine, always revving. And it's the job of the president to stop the war machine. In 1963, President Kennedy tried desperately to stop the war machine, and he made a brilliant step, the most brilliant of any of our presidents from then until today.
Yeah, also, I just wanted to, when you said Ted Sorensen was an author, I think also Norman Cousins may have contributed to the speech. I know he was an advisor at the time, and he was one of the founders of the Committee for Sane Nuclear Policy.
Yeah, I don't think Cousins actually contributed to the text, but he contributed to the movement, and he contributed to the interchange between Khrushchev and Kennedy. He was an informal go-between, and he visited Khrushchev. He was close to Kennedy, and so he definitely played a role. When it comes to the speech, my impression is that it was overwhelmingly drafted by two people, by Sorensen and by Kennedy. And in fact, famously, Kennedy refused to circulate it within the bureaucracy until the day before the speech because he did not want the State Department or the Pentagon or anyone else trying to block the speech. And so this was tightly held, and it was written together with Ted Sorensen. I had the great joy of knowing Ted Sorensen. What a magnificent man. What a magnificent human being. And they were very close partners in this.
Okay. Again, if people have questions, we'd like you to put them in the chat, and we'll try and take them out of the chat. One question here, Jeff, is a person is suggesting that you've been outspokenly supportive of the current president, even though he pulled us out of the last remaining arms control treaties. And I wondered, would you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I'm not supportive of the president per se. I'm supportive of his attempt to end the war in Ukraine and trying to encourage him to recognize a state of Palestine and to negotiate with Iran and to pull back from conflict with China. So what I am trying to do in my particular ways is to support President Trump when he's on the right track and to say as clearly as I can what I think the right track is. I think when it comes to Ukraine, he is vastly better than Biden. Biden, from my point of view, was the worst. I voted for Biden, as you can imagine, but he was a disaster from my point of view in Ukraine, because there were countless opportunities to end that war or to prevent the war altogether. This is a war that, despite what we hear, despite the kind of propaganda, I would say, that we hear, this is a war in which Russia truly and legitimately feels that its national security is at stake, because we had a 30-year effort by the CIA and the deep state to push NATO right up to Russia's border. And that is as reckless as the Soviet Union putting its military bases in Cuba. Both sides should stay away from the borders of the other side so that we don't get into an end of the world clash. And our deep state is so arrogant that they can't think in reciprocal terms. They cannot think about the golden rule. They do not understand that we should not do to Russia what we would never accept Russia doing to us. For example, having a military base in Canada or Mexico. But for us, it's just fine to have our military bases all around Russia, including Ukraine and Georgia. This is our fundamental mistake. President Trump seems to get this, and that's a big advance over the recent presidents, because every president since Clinton has been a party to NATO enlargement eastward, and it's been more and more provocative, and it has gotten us into a very, very deep insecurity.
Would it require Trump to be independent of a lot of the people that are surrounding him?
Yes, because basically half the people around him are the normal deep state neocons. And he's got a small team. It's not very well organized. It's very haphazard. The president himself is not systematic. He is impulsive. He changes by the hour. It's very dangerous indeed. But he has a basic instinct that there's no reason for us to have war with Russia, that it's very dangerous, and that American interests are not to push NATO to Ukraine. This is the basic wisdom that he gets that Joe Biden refused to acknowledge.
Okay. One of the things in that speech, you mentioned this, is that Kennedy talked about the need to focus on what can be accomplished now in order to give people a sort of hope in the process. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts about that in terms of us as citizens. What do you think? Do you have any thoughts on what we should be pressing for, or who should be pressing, how to press forward on, even if it's a small step that could give some initial momentum to this peace process, because we seem so, as you described, the war process is so intense and strong.
There are 4 areas where I think we need to be engaged and where I try each day to make a push. First, on Ukraine, the idea is the fighting needs to stop on the basis of Ukraine's neutrality. This, I think, is the key. Of course, there are other issues. Ukraine's security, which needs to be adopted in the UN Security Council. Russia knows that full well. There are territorial issues which are very real, which have a long history now. But the core of this is for the United States to say absolutely clearly, NATO will not enlarge to Russia's border in Ukraine, because we understand that that is viewed as a profound national security risk by Russia, and we respect that view. That's what we need to say. When it comes to the Middle East, I have a one-sentence answer. We should recognize the state of Palestine on the borders of the 4th of June, 1967. The rest is details. This is the essence of the solution, is 2 states for 2 warring sides with security arrangements between the 2. I'm in touch with almost every government in the Middle East. They all support that, every single one. And they would all make it possible to implement. But in the United States, because of the lobbying, there's a view, oh, you don't have to compromise, you don't need 2 states, we're not going to recognize the state of Palestine. I think that that's a tragedy and a big mistake. The third area is an agreement with Iran, which also is within reach. And there have actually been a series of meetings now, 5 meetings, and it is possible, and I've spoken at length with the Iranians and at length with American negotiators, it's possible to reach an agreement with Iran, that Iran ends any possibility of nuclear arms, that it opens itself to rigorous inspections by the International Atomic Energy Agency and other forms of monitoring, and that the U.S. drop the sanctions against Iran so that Iran can breathe economically and begin to recover from actually decades of U.S. sanctions. This too is within reach. And the final one that I would mention is to avoid war with China. And the main way that we would go to war with China is over Taiwan. Taiwan is essentially the Ukraine of East Asia. If we say to Taiwan, we will defend you, we will sell you arms, we've got your back, we threaten Taiwan's very survival, paradoxically, because what could happen is that Taiwan would then declare independence from China, which would provoke a war. And this is what needs to be avoided. The United States should not interfere in the internal affairs of China. That means the relations across the straits. That means between the governments of the Republic of China and the People's Republic of China. And one thing that it surely means is the United States should not be selling arms to Taiwan. It's just like building Ukraine's army. It didn't save Ukraine. It ended up devastating Ukraine. The same will happen with Taiwan if we continue on our current course.
Thank you. Well, another question from the chat involves, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but someone mentioned the regenerative economics. Mm-hmm. Whether you know about that and whether you have comments on that. Apparently there's some online courses in it.
Essentially, I use that language, but I use a more general concept called sustainable development. which means that we should be pursuing an economic strategy and an economic framework in which we have not only prosperity, but reduced inequality and environmental sustainability to protect the soils, the air, the fresh water, and the climate, and peace and cooperation, as we've been discussing. So that's what I call sustainable development. Regenerative economics tends to be about agricultural production to use nature in a way that is sustaining or regenerating, and to have industrial processes that are not killing the environment, but in which wastes are recycled or reused rather than dumped into the environment. So I can't vouch for a particular course, but it's a meaningful concept.
Okay. Another question is that you spoke to members of the EU Parliament and they seemed receptive. Why do EU leaders continue to be Russia-phobic? Are you in contact with any EU parliamentarians?
I spoke to the EU Parliament, or to another group this morning, actually, by Zoom. Remember, there's self-selection bias. Anyone that wants to come hear me speak either wants to be annoyed, maybe, if they don't agree with me, or they come because they do agree. But it was not a random cross-section of the Parliament. It was a meeting in which my speech was announced, and fortunately, many people came, and it was a very warm reception. But I don't think that it was a random sample of the Parliament. But moreover, the fact is that in Europe, there is a tremendous amount of warmongering right now that's terrifying to me. The British are the worst. Keith Starmer is absolutely every day talking about war. Chancellor Merz, the new Chancellor of Germany, is no better, really, or maybe a smidgen better, but he's talking about sending Taurus missiles to Ukraine, which would then strike deep inside Russia. More of a provocation, it's hard to imagine. Rather than calling President Putin saying, I'm newly installed as Chancellor of Germany and we should meet, he started immediately on the scaling up of missiles attacking Russia. So this is absolutely wrong. President Macron, similarly, I know from discussions with President Macron over the years, I think he knows better than what he's saying, but he is not making sense in what he says publicly because it's a lot of warmongering. So I'm very unhappy about the European scene. I think they make a huge mistake. My main message to them every day is call your counterpart, discuss, open a line of communication. Stop meeting Zelensky for the 1,000th time when you haven't met Putin one time. This is a big mistake. This is not a game. This is not about propaganda. This is not about morale. This is about saving Europe and saving the world. And so for that, sit down and talk with the other side.
Mm-hmm. Okay, another question here is, could you comment on the ICE raids and the protests against ICE raids, particularly, I guess, in Los Angeles, which Kennedy does address our domestic situation as part of the peace process?
Our country is at each other's necks. And of course, I abhor this kind of approach. We're not speaking to each other. We're not calmly analyzing. The idea of the Trump administration, personally of the president, but also the strategy, is come out swinging in every way. And the idea also became, for many governments, many administrations, that the first 100 days are a test of will, not an opportunity to present a case to the American people, not an opportunity for discussion and debate, but you bludgeon as much as possible during the first 100 days because you're measured against history. I find all of this wrong. You know, President Trump has signed, if I have the count right, only 5 pieces of legislation, but he has issued hundreds of executive decrees. So we're living with one-person rule. Now, the reason is that the executive decrees, he declares emergencies here and there, sends the National Guard, sends the military to LA. It's one-person rule. I thought, got over that in 1776, but we're back to it right now. And it doesn't work. It's not the way to solve any problems in this country. The only way to solve problems are to analyze them, understand them, mutually respectfully debate them, speak with opposing sides, and then find some resolution. As President Kennedy said, peace is a process, a way of solving problems. And we're not solving problems peacefully. The president is escalating, of course, in a very dangerous and provocative way. And I have to add, he's taking aim, of course, at our universities, at my students who have been arrested in the middle of the night and dragged off to detention. All of this I find abhorrent, illegal, contrary to the US Constitution, contrary to President Trump's own political success, because none of this works. None of this is a lasting achievement. It just inflames the country. It ends up in hundreds of lawsuits, and it is tying us up in knots.
Okay, a couple of questions came up. One having to do with Rotary International's definition of positive peace. I don't know if you're aware of that. And the other had,
Not specifically.
okay, and the other had to do with the OASIS plan having to do with the Middle East. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
I should be, but I'm not not up to date. But I'd be able to respond to something specific, but I can't respond to either without more background.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let me just see here. One thing I would mention that is that, you know, having to do with Kennedy's approach, again, so much in contrast, he and Khrushchev developed a private correspondence early on, I think, in the administration, just the two of them sort of, I don't know how private it really was.
Yep.
Imagine there were people observing it, but that may have played a role in their being able to have some understanding of each other at the moment of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
There's actually a volume that you can get online, I think, on Amazon for people interested, the Kennedy-Khrushchev correspondence. It's several hundred messages back and forth to each other. It wasn't entirely private. What they said was that it would be within a restricted circle of the most senior advisors, and it would not be made public. So it would not be used to embarrass the other side or press the other side. This would be a private communication. And it's an amazing communication to read. One of the most notable parts of it I mentioned briefly, which is during the Cuban Missile Crisis. During the Bay of Pigs. When the invasion started, the CIA-led invasion by the Cuban mercenaries and anti-Castro Cubans, Khrushchev immediately wrote to Kennedy a background letter saying, Mr. President, there is international piracy underway by your government. I'm sure, Mr. President, you don't know about it, but your government is committing illegal acts in attacking Cuba. And President Kennedy wrote what I regard as his worst ever letter that I know of. He wrote back to Khrushchev saying, no, you're mistaken. We have nothing to do with this. This is something entirely of the Cuban people, and this has nothing to do with us. At which point, Khrushchev wrote back a furious letter saying, Mr. President, don't ever lie to me again this way, because obviously this is a U.S. government action, and we know. And Khrushchev was hopping mad because he had been lied to, actually, by Eisenhower just earlier when the U-2 spy plane was shot down, and Eisenhower had come out and denied that the U.S. had a spy plane and said that it was a weather plane stationed in Turkey that had gone off course. And Eisenhower didn't know that when the Soviets shot down the U-2, they collected the U-2, and the pilot, Gary Powers, was alive and in Soviet custody. So Eisenhower lied bluntly, brazenly to Khrushchev. And then a few months later, Kennedy lied bluntly and brazenly to Khrushchev. And I always regarded that as a prelude to Khrushchev's reckless action. Now, having said all of that, no doubt this correspondence played a world-saving role. They had gone through this. They had basically steadied the relationship. There wasn't brazen lying on each side after that, except, actually, I should say, the deception by Khrushchev about placing the missiles in. But they had a line of communication. And we know that there was an active back channel during the Cuban Missile Crisis as well. And they were sending messages, of course, to each other. And that also required a brilliant finesse. There's a famous moment when a conciliatory message comes from Khrushchev, and then it's followed by a hardline message. And the Kennedy team doesn't know how to respond. The ExComm, the executive committee, and then they adopt the brilliant insight, okay, just respond to the conciliatory one, as if the other one hadn't been sent. And they do, and that is what ends up leading to the resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So it was tactically an extraordinarily wise thing to do, not to quibble with the hard line or to say you contradict yourself, but just to respond to the more favorable message. And Khrushchev took it and said, okay, we go forward and we resolve this crisis. So communication is essential for peace. Essential for peace. And the idea that one can have peace simply on the battlefield is mind-boggling. So incorrect. The idea in Europe that they can't talk to Putin is a disaster and absolutely an ignorance of basic life and diplomacy 101.
One thing I would mention to you is that you're probably aware of this, but there's a newsletter that comes out of George Washington University called Johnson's Russia List, which republishes translations of speeches by Putin, interviews, commentaries by Lavrov. So if people wanted to take the trouble to actually know what Russians are saying and not just depend upon our own media, that is a resource that people can subscribe to, which I think is very valuable. And then again, to the degree that we do that as citizens, we're in some ways, I think, following the advice that Kennedy is giving us about the nature of peace.
Absolutely. I see that Ray McGovern has a question, which is wonderful.
All right, let me just say one other thing to you.
Oh.
In the book I wrote about the Kennedy assassination, I say that Kennedy is a de Klerk without an ANC, and meaning that de Klerk could get rid of apartheid because he could say to people, look, you're going to do it my way or you're going to do it the ANC's way. But Kennedy didn't have a peace movement behind him the way pushing, and that in some sense what we as citizens have to do is form that movement that would then allow us to elect a president that was serious about peace and to stand behind that person.
It's a wonderful observation, Marty. Very important.
Okay, did you say Ray had a question?
I thought I saw Ray signal that he had a question.
You want to? Okay.
There he is.
I do if I'm, oh, can you see me?
We don't see you, but we hear you, Ray.
Okay. Well, hearing is better than seeing me. Thank you, Jeff. And thank you, Marty. Just a comment and then a question. The comment would be, thanks for taking us through Don't Ever Lie to Me Again. That was crucial. Of course, we know that the CIA pulled the wool over JFK's lies and went ahead and then expected JFK to be pressured into using the US military to rescue those guys on the way to Pay of Pigs. So it was doubly bad for Kennedy. He lied, okay? And then it was demonstrable that he died.
Yeah.
Now, the one about Khrushchev and you two, the same thing. Eisenhower was lied to, and then he had to say, oh gosh, yeah, well, because they had carried back. He was supposed to take a poison pill. He chickened out.
Yeah, exactly. He was supposed to take a pill, but also the plane was supposed to disintegrate if it was shot. You know, no way that they could ever capture the plane, Mr. Dulles explained to Mr. Eisenhower, General Eisenhower.
Yeah, the reason I'm so thankful that you raised those is because it happened again. These attacks on the Russian bomber bases, 5 bases, 2 of them were hit, actually. Well, first thing that Lavrov asked Rubio, did you know about this? Now, again, that was good because they had a channel. Biden, I don't think Lavrov had Blinken's telephone, or if he did, his teenage daughter was probably on a, anyhow. There was this link, Lavrov asked Rubio, and I'm sure Rubio said, beats the hell out of me. How about the president?
No way.
Okay, so then the next day or two, Putin and Trump talk. And Putin obviously asked him, did you know about this? And of course, he obviously said, no, I didn't. Now, what's the operative fact here? Whether Putin believed, Trump or not, the readout says that the President of the United States again reiterated that he had no foreknowledge of this event, okay? So whether or not, whatever Putin believes, he's chosen to play this thing down. And I think that's a key. That's a key that the Russians are not going to let the likes of Zelensky and the British and others mousetrap them into sabotaging this fledgling relationship they have with the US. I see hope in that. And I just found it really interesting how differently the Russians played this one, whether they believe Trump. I tend to believe Trump. I don't think they told him, but you know, who knows for sure. So that was the comment I wanted to make. If you have, do you want to comment on that, Jeff? Is that
Yeah, I would like to. First, my guess, and of course you'd have a more expert view than I can't believe that the Ukrainians pulled that off without at least the detailed knowledge of the CIA and certainly MI6, because it looks like an MI6 operation through and through. So I find it hard to believe. Whether Trump knew is quite a different matter, because I don't think he's the most detailed oriented and attentive, and very easily CIA may not have told him. But from the Russian point of view, I think the event itself almost is almost as bad either way. Either the president didn't know, and then what the hell is going on here? That such things can happen, surely with intelligence agency involvement, and we're dealing with the president who probably isn't in control of any of this, or the president knew and he lied, and my God, you know, we also can't trust this. So I think from the Russian point of view, it's a pretty ugly matter in my view. of course, you're right, and I think what's notable in that conversation, again, if I'm reading between the lines correctly, is that Trump said, "I didn't know, but when you say you're going to retaliate, I understand. God, that was annoying and dangerous." And Trump made clear this was a heavy move by Ukraine, and other administration officials like Kellogg, was very explicit. Don't go doing that. That is really messing with the nuclear stability. So I think the U.S. answer, whether it was true or not, was also acknowledging that Russia had a beef here that was real, and that this was a serious matter, and that it wasn't just a casual game. At least that's my interpretation of it.
Okay, I want to just, we're running out of time, and I just want to have one last question that was put in the chat, and then we're going to have a musical selection. The question is, Tucker Carlson sometimes interviews great progressive pacifists, but he also interviews far-right nutcases, and he supports the Heritage Foundation. How do you manage working with him and with anti-war libertarians?
First of all, Tucker and I are friends, and we've known each other for a long time. I've just done a recent interview with him, which I think hasn't been posted yet. But I like his interviews because they are long form, and he asks questions, and then you get to speak for a long time. Now, my feeling is when I'm asked to do interviews, I generally, time permitting, accept them without asking, who are you? So I do interviews on Chinese television, Russian television, American media, and so forth, because I believe we should be communicating with each other. Of course, many people say to me, well, why do you do it? Why do you appear on Russian television or Chinese or with Tucker or anybody else? But I have a completely different point of view about this, which is that dialogue is really important. I happen, by the way, I have to say, to really enjoy being with Tucker and talking, because these are 2.5-hour discussions. They're long, and you get to speak a long time, and Tucker listens, and you get to put your view. So I think that it's a big, noisy world, and lots of people have different views. I'm trying the best I can to be clear about mine, but more importantly, to be helpful, to use whatever knowledge I have to be able to share a particular piece perspective. And this is the idea.
And maybe some of his listeners will learn something.
Well, I hope so, and I believe we all can listen and learn something by listening. So I think that's important.
Well, I want to thank you, Jeff, very much for, again, being with us on this anniversary. And thank everyone who's been participating. And now we want to conclude our meeting with a musical piece of a choral work created by Sharon Abreu. Sharon, do you want to say anything?